Sclerosis is not only Lou Gehrig's disease, it comes close to home. My mother died of ALS. This is a terribly debilitating disease that is perhaps, as a physician now, I'm going to say it's one of the most gruesome disorders that we can get here on the human planet. And here's an example of induced, again, the idea here is induced pluripotent adult stem cells were made and generated from patients with ALS that can be now made to differentiate into motor neurons, and that's what ALS is. It's a disease of neurons that make the muscles get innervated. And people with ALS just get progressive muscular dysfunction and ultimately lose the capability to breathe, and they die a respiratory death. But here's neurons that can be made to be functioning from people with ALS, whereas those stem cells have been made pluripotent and capable of differentiating again into a normal neuron. So this is encouraging, I think. And here are the types of diseases that have been listed among those that might be adequately treated by any kind of stem cell. But keep in mind, I think the field is moving away from embryonic stem cells and thinking about adult stem cells, genetic diseases, Parkinson's disease, spinal cord injuries. I mean, my wife Margaret does a lot with Craig Hospital. And boy, Craig Hospital is a place to open your eyes up in terms of what life used to be like versus what it's like today. And the idea of taking people with brain injuries or traumatic brain injuries or spinal cord injuries and regenerating nerves is an exciting area for adult stem cells that are now pluripotent. ALS, we just talked about, osteoporosis, building new bone, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, heart disease, degenerative joint disease, anemias, and many other disorders. Many medical conditions potentially have value from stem cells. And what ones are currently being treated? Well, a lot of the bone marrow diseases like leukemia, lymphoma, but Parkinson's disease, skin grafts resulting from severe burns, autoimmune disorders. So all of these listed here are currently undergoing trials with again, some with embryonic stem cells, but many increasingly with adult stem cells, where these stem cells have been made to have the capability of cell renewal. And ultimately, this stem cell research can potentially lead to the regeneration of tissues and organs. Now, what are the obstacles that are still before us in terms of this area of science and medicine? The first is the development of alternative strategies for reprogramming adult stem cells into these induced pluripotent stem cells. IPS stands for induced pluripotent stem cells. New ways are being examined every day to make cells from adult cells that theoretically are going to die in the dish into ones that have the capability of replicating. That field is really in its infancy right now. The second is the development of efficient methods for differentiating these cells into various tissue lineages. So we have these pluripotent stem cells. Now I want to make a pancreatic beta cell to cure type 1 diabetes. I got to find out how to do that. And that's not a perfect science yet for sure either. So that's an area where additional work is certainly required. And then ultimately, the very practical end of things is we need to find the money to develop a good medical manufacturing capability and facilities where we can culture these cells for reprogramming these cells and ultimately genetic correction and differentiation into specific cell types. So the concept here is you need the types of facilities that have a tremendous breadth of capability in terms of making these cells and generating large volumes. Because ultimately, taking 10 cells and throwing it into some organ is not going to work. We have to be able to propagate large numbers of cells, and this has to be done in a medically acceptable way. These GPM facilities are one in which every step is taken to avoid contamination. So sterile cell system cultures, et cetera, are needed to do this in an acceptable manner. So I think in closing now, I'm going to leave some questions with you, and I think some of them are fairly obvious. Other ones I think need further consideration. The first is all stem cell research wrong? The second, is embryonic stem cell research wrong? The third is related to actually embryonic stem cells. What about therapeutic abortions? What about in vitro fertilization? I mean, if you think about this, a couple wants to have a child. We think it's perfectly correct, I think, to have them have that ovum fertilized outside the body and implanted. There are lots of reasons a woman's infertile because she doesn't ovulate or ovulate sufficiently, or another thing is that her tubes are blocked and those eggs don't get down the reproductive tract to be adequately fertilized. But those eggs can be harvested by other means. Is in vitro fertilization wrong? Did I hear a yes? Okay. Okay, so we have some yeses there, but in fact, if it is not wrong, what happens to the embryos after, in fact, the in vitro fertilization process takes place? What do we do with all those unused frozen embryos? And finally, you know, like it or not, everybody, God is in control. And I honestly believe as wrong a direction that can happen in the human environment in which we live, a new birth of a new life is God's great gift. And that individual has as much accountability as anybody else, conceived in the usual way under the usual circumstances. So I'm going to stop there. I've tried to broadly cover this area, bring you somewhat up to date of where the field's at, raise some biblical and spiritual issues related to embryonic stem cells, but also leave you with a bit of hope that an adult stem cell taken out and modified successfully could be ultimately used for many diseases we currently throw up our hands on and have no real clear answers. And by the way, that's still theoretical. Other than the use of stem cells from like bone marrow to help use in transplantation after high-dose chemotherapy for lymphomas and leukemias, we don't have really good examples yet about how stem cells have been used to cure human diseases. So in the back.
Well, a few things. When you're talking about the 20% success rate with frozen embryos, isn't a lot of that death due to thawing them?
Some of it is in thawing, for sure.
It was like 40 to 60%.
Mm-hmm.
Embryonic stem cells tend to cause tumors.
They do, and I decided not to cover that tonight. But clearly, embryonic stem cells have the capability, once put back into the body in animals or in humans, of causing tumors. And a lot of these